Colorado Territory, July of 1874. The heat shimmered off the dry earth as Jeremiah McAllister pulled his horse to a halt at the edge of the trail, dust thick in the air, the sun beating down like a curse. He narrowed his eyes. Something was lying in the dirt up ahead. No, not someone. He kicked his boot against the gelding's flank, urging the horse forward. As he rode closer, he saw a woman sprawled in the dust, her bonnet halfway off, her skirts tangled, one hand weakly twitching before going still. Her skin was too pale for this sun, her lips cracked. She looked like she had walked straight out of hell and collapsed in the middle of nowhere. Jeremiah was off his horse before it stopped moving, boots thudding into the dirt. "Ma'am," he said, crouching beside her, voice low and careful. "Can you hear me?" She did not answer. He touched her shoulder lightly, then turned her over. She was young, maybe mid-20s, with auburn hair matted with sweat and dust. Her pulse fluttered beneath his fingers, weak, but there. "Damn it," he muttered, pulling his canteen from the saddle. He trickled a bit of water against her lips. "Come on. Drink." She stirred faintly, eyes fluttering open. "Where?" Her voice cracked and vanished. "You are safe now," he said, lifting her carefully. "Let's get you out of the sun." He carried her to the horse and managed to hoist her across the saddle in front of him. She was too light. He rode fast, cutting across the long stretch of open land toward his ranch house nestled at the base of the ridge. It was nearly dusk when he reached home. He eased her down and carried her inside, laying her on the settee by the window. The ranch house was modest, but solid. He had built it himself, with his own rough hands, the way he had built everything. Jeremiah worked quickly, cool cloth on her forehead, broth on the stove, water by her side. An hour passed before she opened her eyes again, slowly this time, more aware. She blinked up at him. "Where am I?" "My ranch. You were fainted clean out on the trail west of here. Name's Jeremiah McAllister." She sat up with effort, holding the edge of the blanket draped over her. Her voice was hoarse, but steady enough. "Thank you." He gave a small nod. "What is your name?" She looked down at her hands, then up again. "Margaret Monroe." He waited for her to say more, but she just stared out the window, jaw tight, like someone holding in more than just words. "You were on foot," he said. "That trail's empty for 20 miles in all directions. You should not have made it that far." "I did not have a choice," she said. Her voice cracked then, and she looked away fast. He did not press. He just handed her the bowl of broth. "Eat. You look like you have not had a full meal in days." She hesitated, but hunger won. She took the bowl and ate slowly, spoon trembling slightly in her hand. He leaned against the wall, arms crossed. "You running from someone?" She shook her head. "Not someone. Something." He raised an eyebrow but said nothing more. She finished the broth and looked up again. "I had to leave. There was nothing left for me in Kansas. My father died of fever. Then the neighbor who promised to help. He turned out to be cruel. I waited too long to leave. I thought I could make it west, maybe find work. Then I got lost. I did not mean to faint on your land." Jeremiah pushed off the wall. "You are not in trouble. You are safe here." Margaret's eyes met his, then sharp and searching, like she was trying to figure out if he meant it. He did. That night, she slept in the small guest room off the kitchen. Jeremiah stayed up late, fixing the broken fence rails by lantern light. He needed something to keep his hands busy. He had not expected her. He had not expected to feel anything at all when he looked at her. But he had. The next morning, she was up at dawn, standing outside the barn in one of his old shirts and her skirt, clutching a cup of coffee like it was an anchor. "I want to work," she said before he could speak. "I will not be a burden." He studied her for a long moment, then jerked his chin toward the chicken coop. "You know how to feed hens?" "I know enough." She did. She worked hard that whole day, quiet, steady, without complaint. She helped him mend a wagon wheel, weed the garden, sweep the porch. By sunset, her cheeks were flushed from the sun, and her eyes looked brighter. At dinner, she asked him about the ranch. "Used to be my father's," he said. "He died 7 years ago. I have been running it alone since. No one else. No family left. Just me, the horses, and the dust." Margaret looked down at her plate. "It is good land." "It is," he said. "But hard. Like everything out here." She nodded. "I like it." That night, he watched her from the porch as she sat by the fire inside, mending an old shirt of his. She looked like she belonged there, like she had always belonged. It scared him a little how fast that thought came. 2 days later, it rained. a rare, sudden storm that rolled in from the west. They had just managed to get the livestock under cover when the sky broke open. They stood under the lean-to, soaked and laughing, both breathing hard from the run. Margaret tilted her head back, letting the rain hit her face. "I forgot what it felt like," she said. "To be somewhere I do not have to be afraid." Jeremiah looked at her, rain dripping from his hair, and something in his chest pulled tight. "You are not afraid here?" She looked at him then. "Not of you." He did not know what to say, so he just reached out and tucked a strand of wet hair behind her ear. Her breath caught, and he saw her eyes soften. Neither of them moved away. That night, he sat on the porch again, and this time, she joined him. She handed him a mug of coffee and sat closer than before. "I meant what I said," she said. "I want to earn my place. I want to build something. For real this time." He looked at her, heart pounding like a hammer against wood. "You already are." She smiled softly, and he saw it, that light in her eyes. It was not just gratitude. It was hope, and maybe something more. Jeremiah leaned back in his chair, the night quiet around them, the stars sharp overhead. For the first time in a long time, he felt like something good had just begun. 2 weeks passed under the quiet rhythm of work and slow-growing trust. The wheatgrass stretched tall along the southern edge of the property, and the days settled into a kind of steady breath: sunrise, labor, rest, repeat. Margaret took to the routines as if she'd lived them all her life, though she never said much about what life had come before. One evening, with the light just beginning to turn gold, she stood by the corral hammering a loose hinge back into place on the gate. Jeremiah watched from the barn, arms crossed, the scent of dust and horses thick in the air. "You ever fix a corral gate before?" he asked, stepping closer. Her hammer paused. "No," she said, "but I know how to hold a nail straight." He nodded once. "You do." She glanced up at him, a flicker of something unreadable in her expression. "You expecting cattle soon?" "End of the month. Trade herd out of Trinidad. They'll stay a week or two before moving north." She nodded, wiping sweat from her temple with the back of her hand. "You trust the drivers?" "I know the man in charge. Jake Redley. He's honest." She returned to her work without another word, and Jeremiah stayed beside her, handing nails, steadying the wood. The silence between them was no longer awkward. It had turned into something else entirely. Not distance, but space. Room for a thing to grow. Later, as they shelled beans on the back porch, Margaret spoke without looking up. "I was good at numbers, back home." Jeremiah shifted in his chair. "Numbers? My father kept a ledger for a dry goods business. After he passed, I took it over. Bookkeeping, mostly. I could read a sheet faster than most men read the Bible." He let that settle for a moment. "You think you could do that here? For the ranch?" She met his gaze. "I think I already have. You had receipts piling in the corner. I straightened them out. And your supply orders, some were doubled. You've been paying more than you need to." He blinked, then frowned. "You went through my books? You left them open on the table." He rubbed his jaw, then gave a low whistle. "I didn't know. You do now." He looked at her for a long beat, then said, "Show me." Inside, she spread the ledgers across the kitchen table. Her handwriting was neat, columns clean, numbers balanced. He leaned over her shoulder as she flipped pages, her finger tracing costs, corrections, and notes he hadn't thought to make. When she finished, he leaned back, arms crossed. "That's better than I ever kept it." She looked up at him. "You could save nearly $40 a season, just correcting the feed order." He gave a low chuckle, shook his head. "You might just be the best thing to happen to this place in years." Margaret's mouth tightened, though not with displeasure. "I don't want to be just a guest." "You're not." She sat straighter. "Then let me help for real. I can manage the books. Keep things clean. You run the land. I'll hold the rest steady. That what you want?" "I want to be useful. And I want to stay." Jeremiah's nod came slow, deliberate. "Then you will." That night, after she'd gone to bed, he stood at the doorway of the dim kitchen, watching the moonlight catch the ledgers left open on the table. For the first time since his father's death, the house didn't feel like it was waiting to fall in on itself. It felt like something was being built. The next morning, they rode out to the far fence line together. Margaret handled the mare with quiet confidence, reins held steady, eyes on the trail ahead. "You ever think about owning land?" he asked as they crossed a shallow rise. She tilted her head, considering. "I used to. Before things turned. And now, I think about putting down roots. But not alone." They came to the fence, and he dismounted to check the wire. Margaret stayed in the saddle, watching the horizon. A hawk circled wide above the cottonwoods. "You thinking of staying long?" he asked without looking up. "I'm not thinking of leaving." He straightened, brushing dust off his hands. "Then I'll build you a desk. In the corner near the stove. You'll have space for the ledgers." She smiled, small and sure. "I'd like that." They rode back under the rising wind, the air hinting of an early storm. As they neared the barn, Margaret slowed her horse and said, "There's something else." Jeremiah pulled up beside her. "I want to draw up a plan. For the ranch. Long term. What's grown here? What's brought in? What's lost? If we think ahead, maybe we can do more than just get by." He studied her, the way her eyes didn't flinch, the way her voice held conviction but not pride. "You're right," he said. "We've been surviving season to season. Never had a mind for more than that." She nodded once. "But we could." As they dismounted, she reached for the reins of his gelding without being asked, leading both horses toward the trough. He watched her shoulders squared, braid trailing down her back, and felt something shift deep in his chest. Not a thunderclap, just a quiet certainty. That night, he carved the legs of her desk from cottonwood planks, hands moving steady in the lantern light. The ranch no longer felt like a place he was holding together alone, and for the first time, he began to imagine what might grow if he let someone belong to it alongside him. The first frost came early that year, laid a pale sheen across the pasture grass one dawn before the aspens had even finished turning. Jeremiah stood on the porch, coffee cooling in his hand, watching a pair of mule deer move slow and cautious past the fence line. Behind him, inside the house, Margaret's footsteps moved lightly across the floorboards. She had a way of rising before full light, already dressed, already working. "Ledger's done," she said, stepping out beside him. "Feed costs are holding steady, but the spring calves are going to need more space come February. We might have to build on." He nodded, eyes still on the horizon. "We've got the pine stacked by the shed. Could start framing next week." Her breath rose in a faint cloud, the air sharp enough to bite. "We'll need nails. And hinges. If you let me ride into Walsenburg, I can pick them up." He turned to her. "You ever ridden that far alone before?" "No. But I can. I've been memorizing the route on the map." He studied her face, the quiet certainty there. "You trust the mare to carry you that far?" "She trusts me," Margaret said. "That's more important." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he nodded. "Take the revolver. And ride out early. The mountain pass'll be colder than here." She didn't smile, just squeezed his arm lightly before heading back in. It was the first time he'd let her go off the land alone, and though he didn't say it, the hollow in his chest stayed until she came back. She returned the next night, just after dusk, horse lathered and winded but uninjured. Her cheeks were red from the cold, and her hands shook when she passed him the wrapped bundle of iron supplies. "There's a new family settled near the creek bend," she said, voice rough with fatigue. "Black couple, the Bennetts. Drove all the way from Arkansas. They've got 3 children, and not enough would stacked. I told them we'd bring them a load." Jeremiah raised an eyebrow. "You gave them your word?" "I did." He stared at her for a beat. "Then we'll deliver it tomorrow." She exhaled, shoulders loosening. "Thank you." That night, neither of them went to bed early. She sat at the kitchen table, fingers curled around a mug of warmed cider, while he cleaned the harness leather by lamplight. "Do you ever miss it?" she asked. "Being around folks?" Jeremiah didn't look up. "I used to. Then it got easier not to." He paused, then added, "But lately, it's been different." She looked down at her mug, then back at him. "I know what you mean." Later, when they parted for the night, he paused with his hand on her doorframe. The lamp behind her cast a soft gold along her collarbone, and her braid had come partly undone. "If the weather holds," he said, voice low, "we'll finish the new fence line next week. That'll give the calves enough space." She nodded. "I'll draw up the split pattern tomorrow." He hesitated, then added, "You did good today. I don't think I've ever known a woman like you." Margaret tilted her head. "What kind of woman is that?" "The kind who rides into town and comes back with a plan for someone else's winter." Her mouth curved, slow and faint. "That's not so special." "It is here." The next morning, they loaded the wagon with split logs and headed toward the creek bend. The Bennett's homestead was little more than a frame house with a single chimney and a tarp stretched over the porch. The children peeked out from behind the door, wide-eyed, as Jeremiah and Margaret unloaded the wood. "Mrs. Bennett came out with a baby on her hip and a threadbare shawl around her shoulders. Didn't expect you so fast. Margaret passed her a folded note. Supply list. If you need anything else, send word with the next rider. Jeremiah handed Mr. Bennett a roll of twine. Storms will come in from the west. Bank your door with hay and put a rock against the back hatch. The man nodded, quiet thanks in his eyes. On the ride back, they didn't speak much. The sun hung low, and the wind had picked up, whistling through the cottonwoods like a warning. Halfway home, Margaret broke the silence. Why did you take me in? Jeremiah kept his eyes on the trail. Because you needed help. Plenty of folks need help. He didn't answer right away. Then, you looked like someone who would fight to stand back up. I respect that. She sat straighter. I looked like a ghost. He glanced at her. Some ghosts are worth believing in. The wagon jostled over a rut, and she caught hold of the seat rail. You think you'll ever leave this land? No, he said. It's in my blood. I've buried too much here to walk away now. She nodded, eyes on the horizon. I haven't buried anything yet. But I think I'm getting close to planting. Jeremiah reached over, fingers brushing the back of her hand. She didn't pull away. When they returned to the ranch, dusk had bled into full dark. The air held the scent of wood smoke and approaching snow. Inside, Margaret lit the oil lamp, and Jeremiah unhooked his coat, hanging it by the door. She stood by the table, her fingers trailing the edge of the map she'd unrolled earlier. I've been thinking, she said. If we added a second well, you could irrigate the south field. Grow winter rye. Keep the cattle fed without buying. He stepped closer. You planning on staying long enough to see that through? She turned to face him. I'm not planning on leaving. He watched her for a long time, then reached out and tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear. She didn't flinch, didn't look away. I've got room here, he said quietly. Not just on the land. Margaret's hand found his, fingers lacing slow and certain. I know, she said. I've been building it with you. Outside, the wind rose against the eaves, but the house held steady. And for the first time in years, so did he. By late November, the cold had settled in for good. The kind that tightened leather and stiffened gate latches, that hung in the breath and made every step across the yard feel longer than it was. Margaret moved through it with steady purpose, arms full of kindling most mornings, boots already worn at the toes from walking the same packed path from woodshed to hearth. That afternoon, Jeremiah returned from checking the north fence line with a shag of snow clinging to his coat hem. He shook it off in the doorway, stamping his boots, and found Margaret at the table threading a long strip of muslin through the teeth of his mother's old sewing machine. You getting into mending now? He asked, wiping his hands on a rag she'd hung by the stove. She didn't look up. It's not mending. I'm making a ledger wrap. That corner drawer's chewing up the bindings. He leaned against the wall, watching the needle jump. You always notice things like that? I don't like waste, she said, then paused. And I like things to last. He crossed the room and lifted the kettle from the hook. You always this careful with things? I wasn't, she said, voice quieter now. Not until I lost most of what I had. Jeremiah didn't ask what she meant. They'd reached a place where silence was its own kind of trust. As he poured the hot water into the basin for washing, Margaret asked, Why do you keep the back room locked? His hand paused with the pitcher mid-pour. Didn't think you'd noticed. I notice everything. She turned toward him, hands still on the muslin. But I waited to ask. He set the pitcher down. It was my father's room. Nothing in there but dust and old papers. Then why lock it? He dried his hand slowly. Because I haven't had reason to open it. Not until recently. She didn't press. She just turned back to the machine and kept sewing. That night, while she shelled walnuts by the fire, he brought down a small box from the loft, one she'd never seen before. He set it on the floor between them, the firelight catching the worn brass lash. I found this the winter after he died, Jeremiah said, lifting the lid. Inside were folded maps, a journal, and a yellow deed with cracked edges. What is it? She asked. He had plans. Big ones. Expansion, irrigation, livestock trade routes. But he never had the time. Or the help. Margaret unfolded one of the maps, her fingers tracing the lines drawn in fading ink. This is the southern ridge. He marked a second water table. Jeremiah nodded. I thought it was just dreaming. But you've got the books balanced. The herd's stronger now than it's been in years. You made that happen. She looked at him then, something shifting behind her eyes. We made it happen. He didn't look away. I want you to see the room. If you still want to. She rose without hesitation, brushing walnut shells from her skirt. The key turned stiff in the lock, the door groaning as it opened. Dust hung in the air, thick and undisturbed. A cot leaned against the far wall, covered in a moth-eaten quilt. Shelves lined the back, stacked with ledgers, tools, and 3 rifles polished and oiled despite the rest. Margaret stepped inside, her hand brushing a set of blueprints pinned to the far wall. Her voice was low. "You could fit a second storehouse here." He stood behind her. That was the idea. She turned to face him. "You're not just holding on to his past. You've been waiting for someone to help build the rest." Maybe I didn't know that until now. They stood quiet in the musty air, the dust settling between them. "I want to be part of it," she said. "Not just the books. All of it. The land, the choices, the years ahead." He stepped closer. "Then I want you to stay, as more than a partner in work." She looked up, her voice steady. "I already have." He reached for her hand, and she let him. No hesitation, only the soft press of her palm against his. Later that week, they cleared out the room together. She sorted the ledgers by year. He hauled out broken crates and patched the shutter. They didn't talk much as they worked, but there was no strain in the silence now. Just the sound of 2 people building something that would last. By the first snow, Margaret had drawn up the plans for the new storehouse and calculated the timber cost down to the last board. Jeremiah ordered it without question. When the storm came, the house held firmly against the wind. Inside, the fire burned steady, and the warmth between them was no longer something new, it was just theirs. The wind came down out of the Sangre de Cristos hard that January, sweeping the land with a silver edge. Snow drifted high along the northern fence, and the well pump froze twice before Margaret figured out how to wrap it with old burlap and heat stones drawn from the cook stove. Each morning, they rose before dawn, not because they had to, but because they wanted the extra hours together before the work pulled them apart. By then, the new storehouse was nearly complete. Inside, barrels of rye and root vegetables stacked neatly beside sacks of dried beans and crates of fencing iron. Margaret had painted inventory marks herself, using a brush made from hog bristle and a pot of lampblack mixed with turpentine. Her handwriting sharp, slanted stood out against the pine. One night, as the fire burned low and the shutters creaked in the wind, Jeremiah rubbed linseed oil into the handle of a new axe while Margaret stitched a wool lining into his coat sleeve. She had taken to improving things quietly: tools, clothing, arrangements in the kitchen. He had learned to let her, not because he couldn't do without, but because everything she touched became more certain, more useful, more theirs. "I've been thinking about spring," she said, eyes on her stitching. He looked up, setting the axe handle aside. "What about it?" "I want to plant a kitchen garden. Not just root crops. I saved turnip seed, and there's wild mint by the creek. I could dig it up before the thaw." He leaned back in his chair, watching her fingers move. "It's good land for it. Soil's soft near the south edge. I'd like to try growing herbs too. Chamomile, maybe feverfew. I've never had space to grow anything just because I wanted to. You've got that now." She met his eyes, a quiet certainty in her voice. "I know." The next day, they drove the wagon to a neighbor's property 2 ridges over. Martha and Henry Dawson, older folks who'd been ranching longer than anyone else, still living between Walsenburg and La Vida. Their daughter had taken ill with child fever, and Margaret brought jars of preserved peaches and a sack of dried willow bark without needing to be asked. She sat with Martha by the hearth while Jeremiah and Henry sawed through a frozen limb that had split and blocked the barn door. On the ride back, Margaret pulled her shawl tighter and leaned into the corner of the wagon box. "Martha's worried they won't make it through next winter. Henry's back is failing. The boys who used to help have moved on." Jeremiah kept one hand on the reins, the other resting on the brake lever. "You want us to help?" She looked over at him. "I think if we hired 2 hands come spring, we could spare one to help them through harvest. They'd do the same, if things were the other way around." He nodded, his jaw tightening slightly from the thought of what it would cost. But then his shoulders eased. "We'll make it work. I know we will." They arrived home just as the clouds broke, a slow drift of sunlight spilling over the ridge. For a long moment, they stood outside the barn, watching the lights stretch across the snow like a promise. The final beam went up on the storehouse 2 weeks later. Margaret marked the completion with a small carved notch under the ledger shelf, just a line, nothing more. That evening, she brought out a tin of preserved cherries she'd kept hidden since summer and baked a pie that filled the house with a warmth sweeter than the fire. After supper, Jeremiah reached into the drawer by the hearth and pulled out a slim box, wrapped in paper and tied with a strip of rawhide. "I've been waiting," he said, handing it to her. She looked down at it, brow furrowed. "What is it? Open it." Inside, nestled in a fold of linen, was a brooch. Silver, hand-worked, shaped like a sprig of wild sage. "Traded for it last fall," he said. "You said you missed the way Kansas smelled after rain. Thought this might remind you." She held it in her palm, fingers trembling slightly. "It does," she whispered. "It already does." He stepped closer, voice low. "I want to ask you something." Her eyes lifted to his. "I want you to stay. Not just through spring or next winter. I want you to be my wife." She didn't answer right away. She just looked at him, long and steady, and then nodded once. "Yes," she said. "I want that too." They were married in March, in the small clapboard church along the river. The preacher's boots were muddy from the thaw, and his wife brought a bouquet of dried wildflowers to lay on the altar. Margaret wore a dress she'd sewn from calico and lace taken from the hem of an old cotton shift. Jeremiah wore his father's vest and the same boots he'd used to build half the ranch. Afterward, they walked home together, the wagon trailing behind them empty except for a basket of biscuits and smoked meat from the Dawson family. The sun was warm on their backs, and the air smelled faintly of thawing pine. The house welcomed them like it had been waiting. The fire was already lit. A new quilt stitched by Margaret through the winter lay folded at the foot of the bed. The storehouse door stood firm against the wind. In the following weeks, they planted the garden. Jeremiah hauled water from the creek while Margaret turned the soil. She sang some days, soft under her breath, songs he didn't know but came to recognize by the way her hands moved when she sang them. The calves were born strong that season. The fences held. The first mint sprouted on the south edge of the garden, and Margaret pressed it into tea that she served with honey at dusk. Their days became a rhythm neither of them had to name. He knew when she needed silence, and she knew when he needed laughter. They worked without needing to ask. They rested without needing to explain. And at night, beneath the cotton sheets and the quiet hush of wind through the eaves, they held each other like the land itself had shaped them to fit. One evening in late summer, they sat on the porch watching the light fade over the fields. Margaret leaned her head against his shoulder, her hand resting over his heart. "I never knew I could belong somewhere," she said. He pressed a kiss to her temple. "You don't just belong here. You made this place whole." The breeze carried the scent of sage and warm earth. The sky turned gold, then violet, then deep blue. Inside the house, the fire waited. The ledger was closed. The garden was growing. And love quiet, strong, and rooted deep held steady through every season that followed.